I'd like to start out this conversation talking about something I think everybody in America agrees on. You know, we really are concerned about our fellow man. We're concerned about every American. We want America to be prosperous. We want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves and their family. Now, I think we all agree on that. Now, I'll be the first to admit there's a pretty wide diversity of opinion in terms of how do you achieve that kind of prosperity. How can a government help people obtain those kind of opportunities? But at least as we start learning about it, as we start talking about these enormous fiscal challenges, as we start hopefully moving toward real solutions, it'd be, I think, enormously helpful if we don't start out the conversation questioning each other's motives. I don't question the other side's motives. I know most of government, if not all of government, is very well intentioned. There are just some pretty serious negative consequences to some of those good intentions. So I think we'll probably be pointing some of that out now. So let me hop in. I hope you can all see it. Can everybody see it, or should we dim the lights? I didn't want to really dim the lights because I afraid people start falling asleep. I don't want to see that. But anyway, this is the first chart I ever did as a United States Senator. I certainly had a question in my mind: what has been the history of the growth of government? And so staff put this thing together, and I was surprised to see that only 100 years ago. Now, 100 years used to seem like a long time frame to me, but now I got white hair and it doesn't unfortunately seem like that long time frame. But only 100 years ago, the federal government was 2% of our economy. In other words, 2 cents of every dollar the economy produced was consumed by the federal government. Back then, state and local governments were about 5%. So 100 years ago, total government's take out of our economy was 7 cents on the dollar. I would argue that was the vision of our founding fathers, a limited federal government. And then what government there was, by and large, the bulk of that was close to the government, in the states, in the cities. Now, I've met some local officials, some state officials here. You know, I would think, I was town board supervisor here, they would agree with me that local government is very accountable. I mean, if you on the town board here, if you're going to propose, let's say, a property tax increase, you can be pretty well assured that your citizens are going to be sitting in a room about this size, making and demanding, making sure that that property tax is put to good use, spent as efficiently, as effectively as government can. Now, you remove government to, well, let's say, state capital Madison. Comes a little less accountable, a little more out of control. But you know, the good news about state governments, by and large, they're constrained by a balanced budget amendment. Now, they can play some games with some pension accounting and some liabilities, and a lot of states do. So not all states are in great shape. Certainly, we're seeing cities go bankrupt, like Detroit. But by and large, cities and states are in far better financial condition than the federal government. Because when you remove government to that alternate universe, that the city of Washington, D.C., where I now serve, government becomes pretty out of control, pretty unaccountable, which is why we're now $17.3 trillion in debt, which is a number that is larger than our size of our economy. It's a very dangerous level of debt, and it's growing. And we're mortgaging our children's future. So again, looking at the history of the growth of government, 2% 100 years ago, you can see the World War I and World War II, the spikes. When I entered the Senate, the federal government was consuming a little under 25 cents of every dollar the economy produced. Now, because of the 2010 election, because America elected some fiscal conservatives like myself, I mean, the process has been messy. It's not how I would have started moving towards some fiscal discipline and restraint. But at least we provided some fiscal discipline and restraint. And so as our economy has grown meagerly, but it's grown, and as we've restrained spending government, now we're kind of back almost to our 20-year average, about 20.8% is what we're at right now in terms of federal government spending. The problem is, we're on a trajectory over the next 20 or so years to hit about 30% of our economy. So the government's going to start growing again because of all the mandatory spending programs. When you tack on state and local governments, we're already at 35%. On a trajectory to hit about 45 to almost 50% in 20 to 30 years. Total government take out of our economy. Now, that's dangerous. I don't think it's conjecture, I don't think it's theory. When governments in nation states consume a larger and larger share of the economy, those nation states fail. Government is a terrible allocator of capital. It's not as efficient. The private sector is not perfect, but it's a far more efficient allocator of capital. I mean, proof, companies like Solyndra, where investments are made more based on politics than based on financial return. So investment dollars are squandered. Nation states that try this, that try and controlling as much of the economy as possible, fail. I mean, where's the Soviet Union today? It doesn't exist. Venezuela, are you watching what's happening in Venezuela, an oil-rich nation? But because of that socialist experiment of Hugo Chavez, it's a basket case. There are riots in the streets. You know, a lot of times I mentioned Greece. That was a social welfare state that's not doing too well. We've seen riots in their streets. And of course, I like to point out not too many Americans vacation in the island paradise of Cuba after that 50-year experiment. Let's face it, it should be an island paradise. I went to Guantanamo Bay. That looks like the shoreline of Hawaii. It's a beautiful place. That close, that economy should be booming. But it's not because of socialism and communism. Anyway, I don't know why anybody would want to put America on this path toward financial ruin, and I would say cultural ruin. This path we're on, and the sooner we get off it, the better. Now, a lot of my charts and graphs are really designed to dispel myths. Now, I'm a fiscal conservative, so I get accused of all kinds of mean, nasty, ugly things. For example, wanting to put America on an austere spending path or impose draconian cuts on government. Well, let's just look at the facts. 10 years ago, the federal government spent $2.2 trillion. The last couple of years, again, because we've offered some restraint, we've spent a little under $3.6 trillion for about 3 years in a row. Now, this is after spending increased dramatically following in kind of reaction to the Great Recession. But the argument moving forward is, in 10 years, are we spending $5 trillion, which is what the House budget proposes, or are we going to spend $5.7 trillion, which is what President Obama is proposing the Senate Democrats? Again, you don't have to be an accountant or economist to look at this chart and realize that in total, I'm talking in total, nobody is proposing cutting what the federal government's spending. What we're trying to do is we're trying to restrain how much spending grows so we don't hit a debt crisis, so we stop mortgaging our children's future. Another way of looking at this is 10-year spending. 2 decades ago, over 10 years, the federal government spent $17 trillion. The last decade, the federal government spent $31 trillion. And again, the argument moving forward is over the next 10 years, the House proposes spending about $41 trillion. Senate Democrats and President Obama want to spend about $47 trillion, and we'll see what President Obama comes in at with his budget he presents next week. Now, have you ever heard the term $6 trillion of draconian cuts? That's what we're talking about. The difference between spending $41 versus $47 trillion over the 10 years. I mean, only in Washington, D.C. would they call that a cut. But they call it cuts, and it's pretty politically effective to do so. It's a pretty effective political weapon. Now here's a big part of the problem. So much of what the federal government spends is on automatic pilot. It's out of control. In the 60s, you can see 68% of the federal budget was actually appropriated. That's that discretionary spending. That's what you hear about. That's all we ever argue over. That's all we're really budgeting is the discretionary spending account. 32% was mandatory spending and interest on the debt. Back then, it was primarily Social Security. Over the years, that trend has basically been reversed. So now you got about a third of the budget, 34%, that's appropriated. Again, that discretionary spending count, that's what we're always fighting over. There's about $1 trillion out of the $3.6 trillion budget. And you have 66%, or $2.6 trillion, which is our automatic pilot. Now it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's food stamps, it's Social Security, it's all of those other transfer payments and interest on the debt. If we don't reform these things, if we don't get some additional fiscal discipline, in 10 years, less than 25%, 24% of the federal budget will be appropriated. And you have 76% out of control. Now, I come from the business world. I am an accountant. If you ran a business this way, if you ran this restaurant this way, where you basically took 66 to 76% of your budget and said, we're not going to control it, spend whatever it takes on raw materials, spend whatever it takes on health care, or sky's the limit on retirement. This restaurant, my business, your family budget would be bankrupt in no time. But this is how we're running the federal government. It is crazy. We've got to get this under control. Now, I realize, when we switched from talking about, and quite honestly, being outraged collectively about federal budget deficits that were in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and switched to $1 trillion, I knew we were going to have a real problem because, moving from $200 to $400 billion was outrageous, but what's the next trillion or two? Well, it's $1,000 billion. But what this chart is trying to do is bring it back home, personalize it. So if you take our $17.3 trillion federal debt, divide by the population of the United States, which is a little over 300 million now, you'll find out that every American share, each one of your share of the federal debt today is $54,000 almost. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, it was about $36,000. 10 years in the future, it'll be $75,000. Now, I get this PowerPoint presentation to colleges and high schools. When I'm talking to young people, try not to press them too bad, but I do try and get them to concentrate on that debt figure, their personal debt figure. 10 years in the future, it's going to be $75,000. And I like to point out to them, and hopefully the adults in the audience, say, you know, because you're young, you probably ought to tack on about $150,000 for your parents' share and $150,000 for your grandparents' share, because the bad news is that debt's not going away. You are going to be shouldering that debt burden. You, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids. Do you understand what we're doing to our young people? You know, I don't know a parent or parents that would willingly drive up their personal debt, max out their credit card, never ever intending to pay it off, but fully intending to pass it on to their kids and grandkids. Now, I don't know anybody personally. I mean, thank God I don't. Yet collectively, that's exactly what we're doing to our kids and grandkids. I mean, do you understand the utter immorality of that? The intergenerational theft, and we're just kind of shrugging about it. Until we collectively understand that, until we collectively start feeling the guilt of what we're doing, we're still, unfortunately, a long way from solution, which is why my forehead is generally bruised, banging against the brick wall that's called Washington, D.C. Now, I mentioned Greece a little bit earlier. On this metric, citizens' share of the federal debt, you'd actually be better off being a citizen of Greece. Because their share of their federal debt is where we were about 4 years ago. And again, the only reason we don't have riots in our streets is we, to this day, still have the world's reserve currency. We've got the printing press. We're printing money. We're delaying our day of reckoning. But you know, China's trying to develop a currency. They're starting to let it float a little bit more. They're trying to get in a position where maybe they're a little bit more of the world's reserve currency. This won't last forever, which means we better address this problem sooner rather than later.